This is AWANI Global with me, Nailah Huda. And we start off AWANI Global this year looking at the unprecedented military operation launched by the United States in Venezuela. The attack followed by the capture of the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife has since gotten mixed reviews from world leaders. Some questioning and pointing out the violation of national sovereignty and international law. And coming into a week since the attack, we want to look at the immediate fallout in Venezuela as well as potential impact spilling over into other parts of the world. So joining us at this hour to unpack some of these concerns, we have joining us virtually Rowena, Razak, lecturer in Middle East History at the School of Oriental and African Studies or SOAS, University of London, and also joining us Dr. Nenadović, senior lecturer in Global Liberal Arts, also from SOAS, University of London. Thank you so much, Rowena and Anna, joining us virtually at this hour. Perhaps I'll start with Anna. Just your overall reaction to what's happened, what's transpired with starting with the US military operation in Venezuela, and as well, of course, as the seizure of the president and his wife. Just your overall thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nailah. Yeah, so the overall reaction is quite mixed. From a Latin American perspective, we can see that some countries like Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and Brazil have harshly condoned and immediately taken action and precaution against a potential US intervention in their countries. Whereas within Venezuela, there is kind of a polarization. So Venezuela has had a tumultuous history, political history. There has always been a kind of division and polarization between the right and the left. And when in 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected as president, and a leftist president, a former military commander, this was a huge momentum in Venezuela, but also in the broader Latin American history. When he deceased in 2013 after a long battle with cancer, Maduro had been chosen by Chavez to replace him. And we can see since then that the enthusiasm, the kind of the population support of the regime has declined rapidly. So has the quality of life, democratic processes have been annihilated in the past few years. So we can understand why some parts of the Venezuelan population would embrace this invasion as liberation, especially among the exiled Venezuelans. However, it is important to note that this was an unlawful intervention. But it's kind of different. It's interesting to see that Trump is acting very differently to former US presidents. So traditionally and historically, interventions in Latin America from the US side were rather hidden and in collaboration often with military regimes or military or parts of the military, and kind of would act in the background, whereas this time we see an open invasion, the first that we've seen since 1961, when the Cuban Bay of Pigs was invaded, although the soldiers were mostly exiled Cubans. So this is very interesting, and this kind of explains the backlash from presidents in the region. But what I find concerning is the endorsement of this kind of illegal attack and kidnapping of a president and his wife within the parts of the Venezuelan population and within the exilees and the Venezuelan diaspora.
Rowena, what do you make of this?
Thank you so much, Nailah, for having us. And thank you, Anna, for your insights. Very interesting. And I was listening to what you were saying about Venezuela. It immediately made me think about Iran, because with Trump's attack on Venezuela, we're now looking at potential campaigns and potential interventions in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. And the Iranian regime, I'm not here to condone it, I'm not here to condemn it, but I'm just here as an observer to sort of look at how the narrative is being played out. Because there are Iran is also polarizing in the sense that intervention against Iran, if it results in the downfall of the Islamic Republic, is actually quite welcome by certain Iranian exiles and certain groups, specifically those who support a potential return of Reza Pahlavi, the royalist arm, so of the opposition. So there is a concern, and I see a lot of parallels there. Even though, despite big condemnation and the fact that this intervention is deeply illegal, extremely strange in many ways, but at the same time, I think it creates a dangerous precedent for potential new interventions in other parts of the world, not just in the Middle East, but also a bit closer to the UK and the US and Greenland, for example. We're already seeing US conducting operations in the Atlantic Ocean, the seizure of the Russian tank, I believe, just a few days ago. So we're seeing also increased activity of the US in the Persian Gulf. So we're seeing precedents. So condemnation on one side, but I think we're now all very worried about what's going to happen next. What does this portend to? Yeah.
Anna, earlier you were emphasizing the, I guess, the illegality of this entire operation. What do you think this says about the sort of broad authority that American presidents, American leaders have and exercise over military force without Congress oversight, especially in this case? And you were also drawing some parallels to previous interventions, invasions that have been done before in the past. Do you think this is specifically a Trump problem, or this is something to do with the American institution?
I wouldn't say that this is a Trump problem. Maybe he performs it and he enjoys it publicly a bit more than other presidents have done. But this is not new, nor is it against any laws within the US. So we can, if we look back to the end of World War I, when Woodrow Wilson proclaimed that America to the Americans, he did not include Latin Americans, the Caribbean. He really specifically meant the US should dominate the entirety of the continent. And we see that especially the second half of the 20th century was marked by constant interventions from the US in Latin America, with the Operation Condor being the most famous operation and intervention that lasted from 1975 to 1983 and was initiated by the then Chilean dictator Pinochet, with financial aid and military aid from the US. We saw back in 2000 the installation of the Plan Colombia, or Colombia Plan, and de facto invasion, military invasion that was supported by the then Colombian government of Colombia. Again, with the pretense of fighting the war on drugs and fighting against the cartels, but also explicitly fighting left-wing guerrillas within Colombia. So to provide a short answer, this is not new. What is new is kind of how openly it's discussed and embraced by the president.
What do you think, Anna, are some of the immediate implications, fallout that we can expect in Venezuela in, just the past week and the weeks to come? Can we, expect more instability?
So what has already started is a power struggle at the highest levels. We see that, again, unusually for in US interventions, the current interim president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, was actually Maduro's vice president. In the past, we would see that when a regime, especially a leftist regime, was taken down by the US, everyone, all heads had to go. So it's interesting that Delcy Rodriguez was chosen by Trump, as he claims he did, as vice president. We can already see that Maria Corina Machado, who allegedly won the last presidential elections and who recently was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, is making claims for the presidency. So we can see that there is already a power struggle at the highest levels. But I think similar to Iran, we can also anticipate tensions and potentially conflict within the population. Despite the aforementioned decrease and decline in Maduro's popularity within Venezuela, there is still a part of the population that endorses his politics and wants to see him back in the presidency, especially among the military. So we can expect some tensions there. And what Trump and Marco Rubio, who's an exiled Cuban and foreign secretary, have already announced is direct rule in Venezuela. Again, this is very new. Traditionally, the rule would be indirect through military aid, financial aid, through the implementation of multinational corporations and companies. So we can see that everything is happening a bit more openly, which leaves potential for resistance as well, I hope, within Venezuela and on an international level.
On that note, do you think we can expect American boots on the ground in Venezuela? I mean, as you said, this is done a lot more openly than the US is used to in the past. But with Trump declaring that, that they're officially taking over the sort of oil industry, that they'll be a lot more present, what do you think we can expect in the long term?
To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised. Normally, it would be a few CIA agent, a few military is operating within the national military, like we've seen in Colombia. But given that Trump has already seized some ships in the Caribbean Sea closer to Cuba, I wouldn't be surprised if there would be an actual and long-term invasion similar to what we know from the Middle East.
Rowena, of course, we want to understand as well some of the potential impact or implications, the risks that this could entail globally. What do you think this kind of says to international law, the kind of precedent that it sets?
Thank you. This is the issue with international law. It can condemn a lot and for indefinitely, and there's a lot of condemnation against this. And from an international law perspective, this is absolutely illegal. Even from the United Nations, this is an illegal act. However, that doesn't necessarily stop action from happening. And in terms of implementation, and I've said this before, even when the US invaded, the US had military action in Iran just a few months ago, when Israel attacked Iran a few months ago as well. This was all against, very clear, clearly against international law. But how do you implement it? How do you implement international law? It cannot be enforced. Netanyahu has several arrests against him, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's arrested. He is still traveling internationally. As another example. So it's a very, very difficult thing to enforce. The UN has condemned the attack on Venezuela. The EU has condemned the attack on Venezuela, but this doesn't necessarily amount to anything terribly serious. No one has imposed, as far as I know, sanctions against the US. No one has a call for the arrest of Trump. No, not to as far as I know. So in that sense, condemnation is one thing, but again, it sort of highlights the powerlessness of international law to a large extent. And unless there is concerted joint effort for actually something meaningful, Trump's actions are going to go unpunished. And it's shown that he is able to do what he wants. And I think Anna said it rather elegantly, that he enjoys the performance more than others, but he's certainly not the first president to do something like this. Think back to Barack Obama, for example, when he sanctioned the attack on Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Again, this is another example of America going into other people's territories to do whatever is in US interest without regard to national sovereignty or international law. This is not new. So yeah, in terms of international law, I think we just see how powerless most countries are.
Yeah. Following that thought, what do you think is the kind of message that this sends, or the kind of risk that this poses for countries or territories that have been very publicly been the end of Trump's, or the end of Trump's threats, the receiving end. You know, we know right now the kind of focus has been sort of shifted to Greenland, but maybe Anna can chime in a little bit here. Countries like Mexico, Colombia, very clearly on Trump's radar. Do you think that these countries should take this threat, this risk seriously? Maybe you can start with Rowena.
I think there is, I mean, he's shown that he can do it, and if he wants to, he will. I think there is a question of proximity. So countries that are nearer towards, in Latin America, for example, is easier because it's nearer. Greenland also quite near, so it's easier. With regards to Iran, it's a little bit difficult. You would have to either go through a proxy country like Israel or do something very targeted. He is threatened, I believe, by saying if any protesters are killed, they're ready to go in. I think Trump has actually said something like this, but what that actually means in reality is could be very different. I think with Iran, he is going to be still quite careful. Iran is still a rather powerful nation with a pretty strong army, and the Revolutionary Guard is also very strong. So not to be underestimated. And but at the same time, I think his threats are not empty. I mean, I remember the Greenland issue. This was something that he brought up even at his elections. And a lot of us thought it was a bit of a joke and how serious was he. But now it seems that he's actually making good on his threats and will do some sort of intervention, even if it isn't a full-fledged invasion or some sort. He is showing that he is capable of at least destabilizing and shaking up the status quo. So I think there are definitely something behind his threats.
Anna, what do you think? Do you think other countries in Latin America should take this threat seriously?
Yes, I agree with Rowena, and the countries have already taken action. So the Colombian president, Petro, is very much aware that Colombia, which shares a long border with Venezuela and some oil resources, but also, most importantly, water resources that have already been through economic and capitalist enterprises being captured by the US and US companies. There's a raised alert within Colombia, and again, to kind of circle back what I said earlier, there's a lot of potential pressure from Venezuelan, Cuban, Brazilian, Colombian, and Mexican communities, especially in the US, to stage similar interventions in other countries. If we look at Marco Rubio, we should not underestimate his role here either. He is the foreign secretary. He has power. He is very close to Trump, and it's no secret that he's been one of those so-called Miami Cubans pushing for a military intervention in Cuba against the socialist regime for a long time. So even if it might not be as important for Trump personally or for his politics to invade Cuba, he might do this just because he can, to show that he is the powerful man in the White House, and that he can dare what other and previous US American presidents have not done.
Rowena, how do you make of the sort of responses that we've seen from the rest of the world? I mean, some have criticized that the response from, say, the European Union, the EU, and NATO have been somewhat lukewarm. Do you think that they should have been maybe a bit more assertive towards the US?
End of the day, the US is one of their biggest allies. They're stuck between a hard and a rock place. Excuse me, I've got that saying wrong. It's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think even with NATO, it's they're being very cautious. They're very concerned about the US pulling out, and so I think they're all sort of like they've got a very tricky balance, because on one hand, their responses have been quite muted, their condemnation there, but again quite muted because they're concerned if the US pulls out completely. I mean, he's already threatened to pull out in various organizations and so on, and has pulled out of various international organizations. And I think that they're just quite concerned because in Europe, they're worried about Russia. So for them, any kind of pulling out by the US might result in extra exposure to Russia. So this is one of the reasons why I believe that they're quite muted, and I think they will continue to be quite muted against any kind of Trump action.
I guess maybe we can close on a slightly bigger picture kind of question, but of course, a lot of analysts, a lot of observers have been, talking about the sort of rules-based international order, calling it into question. I guess drawing on, some of the things that we've been seeing over the past year as well, with Israel, with Gaza in the picture as well. What do you think this says, Rowena, about the sort of trust, or I guess eroding trust and faith that we've had in multilateral institutions, multilateral frameworks, and the sort of rules-based international order that we've been, sort of made to believe existed to protect, values like national sovereignty and international law. Do you think that this is a sort of big enough incident to make us question, to sort of make us feel like we're at this critical juncture to question whether or not this rules-based order still exists?
It's a very good question, and I think we're definitely in an unprecedented era. I mean, I remember when the United Nations was founded, one of the founding quotations was that it's not to the United Nations is there not to bring us to heaven, but to prevent us from descending into hell. And on some level, despite all of this, I think it's still important to have some sort of organization or some sort of order to kind of maintain a sense and a logic. However, when the parties that are meant to uphold that logic, namely the United States, is no longer participating in any kind of logic, then that's when it becomes very difficult. I mean, the United States is still a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN. And if they are acting like this, and if they're so-called the bad guys now, what faith can we have in an institution or a multilateral institution like this? It's a big moral question that we're facing at this point, at this juncture. There is no clear-cut, gone are the days of the end of the Second World War where we knew who the good guys were and we knew who the bad guys were. It's all eroded. There is no, the masks are off. I mean, as Anna mentioned earlier, the United States, they would be more subtle in their actions and in the interventions, and now it's not. They are very clearly saying what they want. They want oil, they want power, they want this, they want that. So we can't keep putting faith in countries like this. But what is hopeful is that they're not the only voice. There is resistance. There is people's movements, as we've seen with Gaza. The amount of people who are able to sort of point out to the hypocrisy, point out and sort of show resistance and show sustained resistance to bullies, international bullies. So, there is hope. Sorry, this is not the best answer, but at the same time, I'm just trying to sort of understand, yes, difficulty internationally, but hope in terms of people power and people's voices.
Yeah, and just to close, I guess, how much of this do you think is really about Venezuela and its politics, and perhaps even Latin America, or is this maybe just a show of the American dominance on the global stage? Earlier, before we started the show, you were asking me, to what extent does the Malaysian audience understand what's actually going on in Venezuela and I guess overall in Latin America? And I would say, not to a deeper extent, perhaps even on a surface level, as much as we know what's happened with the US operation. But, I guess there's not been a lot of conversation on what's actually happening within Venezuela, what the people of Venezuela actually want. So what are your thoughts on this, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. So the US, Trump, none of their politicians care about people in Latin America. Latin America has always, starting with Mexico down to Argentina and Chile, has always been the resource ground and exploitation ground for the US. We see that in Mexico, with the border region becoming one of in the late 1980s, 1990s, becoming the prime spot for factories, exploitation of labor power, manual power, especially women's labor power. We see that resources have been extracted since at least the 1950s, much earlier, actually 19th century, from across the Caribbean and Latin America. There has been substantial resistance to that. And the Latin American and Caribbean left are a threat to the US, and the US has never hidden that fact. So if we look back at the Cold War, it's always been against the left. With US not obvious, but kind of now that the archives are slowly opening up, being available to the public, we can see the extent of the actual brutal impact that US politics have had on individual humans' lives, where we know that leftist politicians have been brutally assassinated, militants thrown into the Atlantic Ocean by the Argentinian military. That's all very well known, and everyone knows, at least in Latin America, it's also very well known that this has been partially funded by the US. So Trump does not care about Venezuelans. He might say that he cares about democracy and freedom, but it's questionable when he's repressing democracy in his own country, how much can he actually care about democracy in another country. But maybe, if I may just urge everyone to look and put faith in African countries and African leaders that we've seen, that most recently South Africa is the most prominent one, but also the African Union have kind of harshly condemned any actions and have actually taken legal steps to at least, if we look at the case of Gaza and the genocide in Palestine, to make the global population aware of these issues. So maybe we should keep a closer eye on Africa and African leaders and their next moves, and hopefully they'll be able to lead us out of this.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Anna and Rowena. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for trying to at least inject some optimism despite it all. Thank you for joining us. That was Rowena and Anna from the SOAS University of London, joining us to break down some of the concerns that's been happening around the US military operation in Venezuela. That is all on AWANI Global this week. We'll catch you next time.